For 11 years, I routed every single flight in your father's airline. I told him, my voice steady, even as my badge weighed hot in my hand. And now you're firing me because your fiancé does ops now. He didn't even blink. Effective immediately, he snapped like he was canceling a meeting, not cutting out the brain of his own network. So I handed him my badge, looked him in the eye and said, "You've got 20 minutes before the first planes are grounded. Tell your dad I said good luck. My name is James Knox, and I was the ghost in the system that kept his family's airline in the air. Before I share my story, I'd love to know you are here with me and listening. Comment listening or just say hi and tell me where you're from. I love seeing how far a story like this can reach. Sometimes knowing someone is really there makes all the difference. And if you feel even a little bit of anger or sympathy hearing how this started, consider subscribing to this channel so I can keep telling you what really happens behind those glass office doors. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything." The hallway was too quiet for a midweek peak travel afternoon. The displays lining the glass walls flickered with departure updates, delays, weather advisories, things I used to monitor like the lines of my own palm. But that day, every screen felt like an omen. A couple of managers passed me, the ones who normally nodded or asked about routing adjustments. This time they barely met my eyes, then looked away with that tight, guilty expression people get when they've been warned not to intervene. The email in my phone still glowed. James 14th floor. Conference room. A. Now. It was from Colton's assistant. No explanation. No agenda. No courtesy. I already knew something was off. Access privileges had quietly disappeared from my account over the past 2 weeks. A few recurring meetings somehow dropped me from the invite list. One of my scripts had been disabled by accident. I told myself it was nothing, told myself to stay calm, told myself this was just another operational briefing gone wrong in scheduling. I'd spent years teaching myself not to react, not to escalate, not to make noise. But as I crossed the glass walkway into the command center, the place that used to feel like home, I heard whispers. My name. A quick hush. A turning shoulder. Outside the conference room, I could see their silhouettes through the tinted glass. Colton at the head of the table in a crisp white shirt, Savannah beside him tapping absently at her trackpad, her hair pulled into the polished bun she wore on media days. Their laptops glowed with network diagrams, my diagrams, except now they were labeled with her initials. The irony almost made me laugh. Almost. Colton didn't waste time. The moment I stepped inside, he launched into a rehearsed corporate script about transitioning into a new era, younger strategic leadership, and aligning operations with brand direction. Savannah pretended to scroll through notes, even though she hadn't taken any. Then he said it, the line that cracked the whole room open. "Your role no longer fits the direction Sunland is moving toward. Savannah will handle all strategic ops going forward. Your employment ends effective immediately." I stood still. I had to. If I didn't lock my knees, I wasn't sure what part of me would collapse first. 11 years of routing, every departure, every contingency plan, every emergency diversion dismissed in a sentence that sounded like a press release. I waited a beat. 2. Then I asked quietly but clearly, "Let me understand this. For 11 years, I routed every flight in your father's airline network. And now you're firing me because your fiancé does ops now." Savannah's cheeks twitched, but she didn't lift her eyes. Colton straightened his shoulders like a man who had practiced dominance poses in a bathroom mirror. "Effective immediately," he repeated. So I reached up, unhooked the badge I'd worn since I was 20, and placed it on the table. My hand didn't shake. I noticed that with a strange, detached pride. And then, still calm, still steady, I said the thing that wiped every trace of smugness off Colton's face. "All right. But let me give you some context. The flight planning system you're using, the routing logic, the weather scripts, the NOTAM filters, the parts that actually keep this network running, they're not in the core software this company bought." Colton blinked. Once. "They're in my hands," I said. "And you have about 20 minutes before FAA starts holding flights because no valid routing signature exists in your system. Tell your dad I said good luck." He opened his mouth, but no response came out. He thought I was bluffing. They always thought I was bluffing. They didn't understand that I didn't need to bluff. Because in the weeks leading to this moment, I had quietly done what no one expected the quiet guy in the corner to do. I had separated my personal data from the company servers, migrated my privately built scripts onto my own secure cloud, and most importantly, I had restructured the routing workflow so that every approved flight plan required one specific digital signature, mine, the one tied to my account, the one they had just deactivated without a transition. I walked out before anyone found words to stop me. And as the elevator doors closed, I felt the first shift inside me, not triumph, not rage, but the startling clarity that comes right before a storm breaks. They had no idea how much I had prepared for this, and they had even less idea why I had chosen today of all days to step out and let the system speak for itself. I wasn't born into aviation power or legacy money or a family name that opened doors. I was a 20-year-old senior in an aviation operations program who took a part-time job at Sunland Airways, mostly because it paid $1 more than the other student jobs on campus. My role was as close to disposable as you could get, entering NOTAM updates by hand-checking weather advisories one by one, printing fuel burn estimates that were already outdated by the time they hit the table. The system Sunland was using back then was a dinosaur, slow, fragmented, and relying on too many manual inputs for a growing airline. Most of the smaller airports weren't even mapped correctly. When storms rolled through the Midwest, the entire network buckled. I hated the inefficiency, but I loved the puzzle. I could sit in front of radar maps for hours, tracing alternate routes in my notebook, watching jet streams bend and merge like living things. And because I couldn't stand entering the same numbers 10 times a day, I wrote my own tiny macros, Excel shortcuts, little weather scrapers pulling free API data, color-coded NOTAM grids. Nothing fancy, nothing official. Just a curious kid fixing broken furniture in a house he didn't own. Then one afternoon, Phoenix to Chicago was flashing red across the ops board, storm interference, high delays predicted across multiple carriers. I sketched a new routing, fed it into the macro-filled spreadsheet I'd built for myself, and handed it to the shift supervisor. He shrugged, sent it up as an alternate, and 2 hours later our plane landed with half the delay everyone else took. Suddenly, supervisors were calling James, check this one, like I was some kind of weather whisperer. But the day everything changed was the day a domino of delays hit the network. A plane got stuck in Colorado, which pushed a Tucson departure out of rotation, which left a Vegas crew stranded, which meant Phoenix was about to run out of legal flight hours for half its pilots. While chaos spread, I sat down with my laptop, not the company's, and rerouted the entire chain. One by one, the lines realigned, the crew rotations synced, and the whole schedule breathed again. Someone must have told Harold. Because the next hour, the founder of the airline himself walked into the ops room. No entourage, no announcement, just a man with tired eyes and curiosity. He asked, son, what did you do here? Not accusing, not territorial, just genuinely wanting to know. I showed him the digital map I'd stitched together, a messy homebrewed prototype of what I would later call Z-Map. He studied it like an engineer examining the blueprint of a machine he secretly wished he'd invented. Then he said the sentence that set the entire future in motion. This is your tool. The company can fund it, but it should carry your name. Airlines live or die by people like you, not by glossy posters. He didn't take it from me. He didn't bury it under corporate ownership. He handed it back with a level of respect I didn't know how to hold at that age. And then, as if he were tossing me the keys to a very expensive car, he told IT to give me deep system access privileges only senior planners had. That access became my BMW. Not shiny metal, but data streams, permissions, and a living map I could shape daily. I tuned it the way someone tunes an engine cleaner, logic, smarter weather layers, real-time NOTAM ingestion, fallback routes the system didn't officially support. But here was the twist no one saw coming. Harold's generosity was a double-edged sword. He trusted me so fully he never forced me into a tight legal contract. No one documented who owned Z-Map. No one formalized whether it belonged to me or to Sunland. And over time, everyone simply assumed that anything I built was automatically part of the corporate machine. Colton grew up with that assumption. Savannah benefited from that assumption. And that unspoken ambiguity, the very freedom that allowed me to innovate, would later be the loophole they tried to push me through when they thought they could replace me. They never realized the truth. Harold had handed me the keys, not the company. And I had been driving ever since. When Harold stepped back into a chairman's role and Colton officially slid into the CEO seat, Sunland changed almost overnight. The airline I'd grown up inside, gritty, flawed, practical, was suddenly wrapped in glossy campaigns and pastel gradients. The new logo rollout came with drone videos of desert sunrises, influencer partnerships, and a tagline about reimagining the journey, which sounded poetic, but didn't help anyone get through Denver weather in February. Colton loved it. He loved talking about brand presence, narrative, cohesion, traveler experience, emotional arcs. He rarely mentioned duty time limits, slot constraints, or a NOTAM update that could wreck an entire morning's schedule. And I stood somewhere between pride and worry, proud that Sunland was finally being seen, worried because everything I did lived far below the camera line in the places no spotlight ever reached. Then came Savannah. She entered the building like she'd stepped out of the campaign photos, polished, articulate, the kind of person who could charm a boardroom before she even connected her laptop. She had a marketing background in tech, not aviation, but that didn't matter. Colton introduced her as the new Director of Network Strategy. The title alone nearly made the older ops supervisors choke. Many had 20 years in the field and had never heard of such a position. But the explanation was simple: she was here to bring fresh vision to our route network. The first time she visited ops, Colton brought her down himself. "James will show you everything technical," he said, like I was a piece of equipment. Savannah smiled warmly, maybe genuinely. She wasn't cruel, just ambitious. But the way her eyes flicked across my screens told me she already saw ZMAP not as something I built, but as something she would one day present. I shook her hand anyway, trying not to project anything onto her except good faith. At first, she asked small things. "Can you walk me through how you build a high-demand day? Could you export this graphic for me? It's perfect for a slide." I explained everything down to the pressure altitudes and the slot math. I showed her my annotations, weather layers, the fallback logic I'd tuned over years. I didn't think about intellectual property or credit. I thought about helping the airline run better. That was always my default. So when she asked for a clean export of the week's routing overview for her upcoming meeting, I sent it gladly, even adding notes so she could explain the logic with confidence. A week later, watching the internal live stream of the leadership meeting, I saw my work up on the main screen but my name nowhere near it. Savannah stood at the front of the room presenting the structure of the new network strategy as if she had architected the logic herself. The camera caught Colton leaning back with pride, telling everyone how intuitive her insights were. I sat at my desk in ops with a plastic fork over lukewarm leftovers and tried to swallow the heaviness stuck in my throat. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe recognition wasn't the point. The planes were flying. The passengers didn't care whose name was on the chart. That's what I told myself because it was easier than acknowledging the truth. Slowly, things shifted. Savannah asked for deeper system access. Colton approved it with a flourish, insisting she needed it to own the strategy end to end. It came to me asking for versions of my scripts they could integrate into the official system. I gave them the simplified ones, the ones that wouldn't break anything, but also wouldn't replicate the brain behind ZMAP. I wasn't hiding exactly, I just wasn't handing over the keys. Savannah grew more comfortable suggesting new routes, ones designed for aesthetic value, sunrise photos, influencer partnerships. She'd say, "Can we run a morning arc over the lake?" The lighting is unreal. And I'd have to explain gently about mountain wave turbulence, about narrow corridors of safe altitude, about military airspace that didn't care about Instagram. Still, she'd push, and when Colton backed her, I'd quietly rework their ideas into something safe. She got glowing reactions in meetings. I got more late nights adjusting what they didn't understand. The first time I saw a full press release crediting her for the optimized network vision, I was in the break room staring at my sandwich. Every route highlighted was one I had designed. Every efficiency win had come from scripts I wrote at 2 a.m, years before anyone bothered to ask how Sunland stayed on time. But the world saw her smile beside a renovated jet bridge talking about innovation. I told myself I didn't need my name on anything. I told myself what mattered was safety, stability, passengers not getting stranded. I told myself a good engineer is invisible. That lie held me in place more tightly than any contract could have. And yet in the background I began noticing something else. The official system could no longer function cleanly without my invisible layers. My weather feed integrations. My custom NOTAM filters. My fallback route logic. Without them, the core software stumbled. With them, everyone assumed Savannah's strategy was flawless. I could have used that knowledge to protect myself. Instead, I turned it into a burden. If I quit, they'll crumble, I thought. And I'd be responsible for the chaos. That was the seed of the guilt that kept me tethered long before anyone tried to cut me loose. 3 or 4 years into Colton's tenure, Sunland looked stronger than ever from the outside. On-time performance was praised in trade magazines. Bloggers loved the clean brand aesthetic. Investors applauded the nimble network strategy. Meanwhile, inside the ops room where I worked, the reality was that almost every time something went wrong, the same quiet figure, me, was the one holding the seams together. My title said Senior Network Planner, but in truth I was the only person who understood every layer of ZMAP, the routing logic. The scripts beneath the scripts, the emergency overrides the weather weights, the way it all breathed together. Everyone else saw the polished dashboard. I saw the engine underneath it grinding like a heart under strain. Each day began with scanning weather patterns, checking slot programs, reviewing NOTAM updates, watching trended winds across mountain corridors. A wildfire closing airspace in California. I built alternate paths. A sudden military exercise over New Mexico, I rerouted half a morning's departures. A snowburst in Denver, I restacked the arrivals and swapped crews to avoid illegal duty extensions. And every time things went smoothly, the internal report credited network strategy. Savannah would highlight it in a slide deck, calling it our adaptive framework. I would be at my desk with a headset on, sending updated paths to dispatchers. I didn't expect applause, but there was a hollowness in watching others take bows for work they didn't even know existed. Savannah, to her credit, was charming. She called me our behind-the-scenes wizard, as if that made up for the fact that whenever things broke, she pushed them to me with a sweet smile and a message like, "Can you handle this real quick?" But the truth was simple. If she had to choose between accuracy and optics, optics always won. And if she needed a technical miracle, she came straight to me. One afternoon, she pitched a sunrise route and early morning arc over mountain lakes designed to create breathtaking photos for their summer marketing push. I warned her that corridor had unpredictable winds and was notorious for sudden turbulence. I explained that at that hour the probability of diversion was high. She nodded, then proceeded as if I had endorsed the idea. Colton loved the concept. Marketing had already storyboarded the campaign. So I did what I always did, quietly prepared the real safety net. I programmed ZMAP to detect abnormal winds in that corridor and automatically recommend a fallback route without requiring manual approval. The morning of the launch, the winds spiked exactly as I predicted. ZMAP rerouted the aircraft seamlessly. Passengers barely noticed. The press wrote glowing summaries of how Sunland balanced beauty with safety. Savannah posted the article. A week later, she presented the situation in a leadership meeting as proof of her flexible strategic mindset. Colton looked at her like she'd reinvented aviation. I sat in the back answering technical clarifications while the narrative shifted in front of me. It wasn't resentment that hit me, it was an odd, sinking realization that the people controlling the story had no idea what story they were even in. That night, I opened my laptop in the dark ops office and created a file titled Log. Things I did that no one knows. I didn't know why I started it. Maybe I wanted to stop gaslighting myself. Maybe I wanted something to hold on to when the credit kept slipping from my hands. I listed dates, scenarios, decisions, what I did, what they said happened instead. As the list grew, my chest tightened. I hadn't noticed how much of the airline's stability rested on invisible fixes. One evening, staring at that growing log, I understood something I'd never said out loud. Sunland wasn't supporting me. I was supporting Sunland. If I stepped away, if I stopped patching the holes, stopped predicting their mistakes, stopped cleaning up after their campaigns, this airline people praised for efficiency would shudder. They had built an entire era of performance on work they barely acknowledged and didn't understand. And once I realized that the question I'd avoided for years finally surfaced clear and sharp. If I walked away, what would actually happen? That was the first moment I felt the ground shift beneath everything. Not because I wanted revenge or recognition, but because for the first time I saw the truth. I wasn't just an employee. I was the pressure valve of the entire system. And if someone ever tried to rip me out of the machine wouldn't fail immediately, it would fail exactly 20 minutes later. As Sunland grew, the pressure around cost efficiency hardened into something almost clinical. Fuel prices climbed, airport fees spiked, labor costs rose, and every meeting began with Colton saying the same thing. Every minute of delay is money. Every extra mile is money. It wasn't that he was wrong. It was that he treated operational safety margins like elastic bands, stretchable as long as the numbers looked good. I became the one expected to stretch them. Routing requests shifted from what's safest and most stable to what burns the least fuel, and how do we cut 2 minutes off this leg? Even Savannah, who had once tried to understand the nuance of ops, started parroting executive language. Can we shave the route a bit closer to the weather edge, she'd ask. Can we take this seldom used airway? The landing fees are lower. I'd review each request with clenched teeth. They weren't asking for miracles, they were asking for risks disguised as efficiency. So I did what I had learned to do: build hidden safety layers behind their decisions. I coded fallback logic into ZMAP so that if a storm advanced 5 miles faster than predicted, or if turbulence spiked, the system would automatically switch to a safer alternative without requiring manual approval. They got their clean chart. I ensured the passengers stayed alive. One afternoon, the compromise almost snapped. A westbound flight hit a fast-moving front that had shifted sooner than any forecast predicted. The fallback route kicked in, but because the system had to reshape crew legality and slot constraints on the fly, the flight ended up delayed over an hour. Within minutes, Savannah typed in the leadership group chat. Who approved this routing? James didn't forecast properly. This shouldn't have happened. My pulse hammered, but I didn't argue. I pulled the logs, including the email I sent her outlining the weather risk, the exact timeline showing the storm's unexpected acceleration and the fallback activation. I sent everything back to the group. No one replied. The next day, the incident wasn't discussed and no apology came my way. But something lodged deeper in me, a clear recognition that I wasn't just overlooked anymore. I was a convenient shield when outcomes weren't perfect. A few weeks later, staying late for another Midwest storm pattern, I passed Colton's office and saw his door cracked open. He was on a Zoom call with a board member. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the words froze me in place. James is good, he said, but he's too tied to the old system. Savannah understands the bigger vision now. Long-term, we need a structure that doesn't depend on a single person. In a single sentence, he had reduced 11 years of innovation to a liability. I closed the file I'd been reviewing. For the first time, I felt like a piece of outdated code they were preparing to uninstall. That night, I went home and dug out my employment documents. Buried in the generic legal language was a sweeping clause. All intellectual property created during employment is property of the company. At first glance, it seemed threatening. But then the loophole hit me. ZMAP wasn't created during my employment. I built the first versions while I was still a part-time student worker, using my own laptop on my own time. Sunland's system had grown around ZMAP, not the other way around. Still, everything was blurry enough that if they wanted to claim ownership, they would. And I knew how companies worked. They would take everything if I let them, and thank me for my loyal service as they shut the door behind me. For the first time, I let myself imagine leaving. Really leaving. I sat in the parking lot watching a Sunland plane rise into the night sky, the reflection of its lights pulsing on the windshield. Years earlier, that sight filled me with pride. Now it felt like watching something balanced on scaffolding no one bothered to reinforce. The question surfaced before I could push it down. If I walked away one day, would I do it silently, letting the system collapse into chaos? Or would I find a way to protect the passengers while no longer letting myself be mined until there was nothing left? I didn't know the answer yet. But that question was the seed that eventually led me to the front porch of the man who started everything. The weeks that followed pushed me closer to breaking than I'd ever been. A sequence of crises hit back to back, a line of storms drifting unpredictably across the Midwest wildfires. choking half the California airspace, a damaged runway at a regional airport shutting down an entire quadrant of our network. Savannah's messages came rapid fire. Can you handle this? I need a clean report for tomorrow. Fix the routing for 1843. Colton wants the fuel numbers lower. Please adjust the crew legality issue before morning. It'll ruin my slide. I spent night after night at my station surrounded by glowing monitors drinking lukewarm coffee until my hands shook. Meanwhile, every leadership recap credited network strategy's strong adaptability. My name was never mentioned. Gratitude never arrived. The only proof of my existence was the absence of disaster. One night after a brutal weather event, I stayed alone in the ops room long after the last dispatcher had gone. The building hummed around me, empty, fluorescent, unforgiving. Something inside me snapped, not out of anger, but exhaustion. I opened the system logs and began tallying. How many times had I manually intervened in the past year? How many fallback routes had triggered because of scripts I wrote? How many potential incidents had been avoided because I'd recalculated crew hours at 2 a.m.? The number staggered me. It wasn't a few heroic saves, it was a parallel operating structure I had built, maintained, and kept alive without acknowledgement. Sunland wasn't running on its official system. It was running on mine. That realization was a punch to the ribs. It wasn't pride, I felt it was fear. Because if one person is silently holding up a system, that system is already broken. I sketched a diagram showing what would happen if I vanished for a day, fallback logic gone, weather weights absent, no TAM filters, missing crew pairing, invalid. The network wouldn't collapse instantly, but the cracks would spread fast. For the first time, I truly understood I was a single point of failure, and they didn't even know it. Shaking, I scrolled through my contacts until I saw a name I hadn't called in months, Harold. I didn't expect him to answer at midnight. But he picked up on the second ring. Talk to me, son. I told him everything. The endless nights. The credit misalignment. The pressure to hide risk. The quiet attempts to phase me out. The vulnerability of a system pretending to be robust. When I finished, he didn't scold me, didn't soothe me. He simply said, come to my house in the morning. Bring your laptop. Don't make any big decisions tonight. The next day, his porch looked exactly as I remembered: weathered wood, quiet street, a thermos of coffee already set out. I sat across from him and opened my laptop. For nearly an hour, I walked him through the architecture, Z-Map's evolution, my scripts, the safety nets I'd woven beneath Savannah's polished slides, the way the company relied on all of it without acknowledging the dependency. He listened without interrupting, marking small ticks in a yellow notebook each time I described a structural vulnerability. When I finished, he took a quiet breath. They're letting you carry their risks, he said, and calling it teamwork. They want the fruit, but they're swinging an axe at the root. He stood, walked inside, and came back with a sealed envelope. I set up an emergency fund years ago, he said. I thought it'd be for family crises, but it turns out the crisis is what they're doing to people like you. He didn't frame it as charity. He framed it as correction. With that fund, he proposed a path I hadn't dared imagine, separating Z-Map into an independent platform with legal structure and ownership clarified. Turning my role into a consultancy rather than unpaid labor. Establishing boundaries no executive could quietly erase. I confessed my biggest fear. If I leave, suddenly people could get stranded. I don't want passengers paying the price for a fight they didn't cause. He nodded, as if he already expected that answer. Then he outlined a plan: move my scripts to my own infrastructure without harming theirs. Establish a digital signature requirement tied to my credentials. And if they cut me abruptly, I would still have the choice to approve plans temporarily as an external contractor, ensuring safe continuity without letting myself be exploited. For the first time in years, I could see a path where I wasn't sacrificing myself for the sake of a system that didn't even see me. Driving back from his house, something had shifted. The resignation, the guilt, the sense of obligation, they weren't chains anymore. They were facts I could work with, shape, and navigate. I had evidence. I had the founder's backing. I had a blueprint that protected both the airline's passengers and my own sanity. For years, conflict had been something I endured. Now it was something I was preparing to face. The quiet man behind the system wasn't going to stay quiet forever. In the days following my conversation with Harold, I moved with a careful, deliberate clarity I hadn't felt in years. The frustration was still there, scraping under my ribs, but now it had direction. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a dead end. I had a way out and a way to protect what I'd built from being swallowed whole. My first priority was simple: separate what belonged to me from what belonged to Sunland. ZMAP had lived too long in a gray zone, treated as a communal miracle rather than the personal project it actually was. I needed to give it a spine: documentation, versions, ownership, and identity independent of the airline that had quietly grown reliant on it. I rented a private cloud server in Denver under my own name, paid with my own card. No Sunland credentials, no shared accounts, nothing that tied it to the company. From the code stored on my personal laptop, the code that predated my full-time employment, I rebuilt ZMAP in its truest, most complete form. I modularized it, cleaned up the architecture, and documented every function. For once, I wasn't writing for an invisible audience. I was writing for the future I'd kept putting off. Meanwhile, on Sunland's servers, I left behind only the bare minimum. The parts they had officially paid for remained. Everything else: the enhanced weather layers, the advanced NOTAM scrapers. The predictive logic for fallback routes came from APIs I had personally funded over the years. When I checked the receipts, the realization hit hard: the backbone of Sunland's advanced routing system had been built on charges going to my personal debit card. If they wanted to claim ownership, they'd have to explain why they never paid the bills. I collected every invoice, every API renewal email, every ticket showing that ZMAP's real engine wasn't something they'd ever invested in. With each saved document, the picture sharpened. They had no idea how much they owed me legally or otherwise. Next, I approached IT with a proposal framed as a compliance upgrade. I requested an additional security layer for all flight plans, a mandatory digital signature from the network supervisor role. Because I had always been that final checkpoint, no one questioned assigning the credentials to me. The reasoning was professional. If flight plans were going to FAA under my name, I needed a secure signing system. But the unintended benefit, at least unintended for them, was that without my signature, their routing process would stall. It wasn't sabotage, it was responsibility. If they wanted me to take liability, I needed control over what was being submitted in my name. Around this time, Harold connected me with an IP attorney downtown. I brought my laptop, my old notebooks, the relics of ZMAP's early days. He reviewed everything: timestamps, file histories, server origins. His conclusion was blunt: anything developed before I became a full-time employee, or anything built using my own resources, didn't automatically belong to Sunland. And because the entire system grew from my original personal codebase, I had a valid claim to partial or full ownership of its architecture. We began building a formal dossier: documentation version, histories, origin logs. ZMAP was no longer that thing James made. It was a product with a lineage. And that meant I wasn't just an employee maintaining a tool, I was the owner of the blueprint. Harold called me again after reviewing the legal updates. He didn't waste time. "If you start your own routing consultancy," he said, "I'll help fund it. Quietly. You keep control." Hearing that from the founder of the airline, the man whose vision I'd protected for a decade, was heavier than praise. It was a challenge, a responsibility, a reminder that if I stepped out on my own, I wasn't doing it alone. The next jolt came from IT. During a joint session, I spotted a junior engineer struggling with a script I didn't recognize. When I asked about it, he admitted Savannah and Colton had asked them to recreate some routing logic internally so the system doesn't rely on one person. I looked at the script: simple if-else statements, shallow weather logic, no multi-layer fallback. It couldn't have supported more than 3 straightforward routes. They thought they could reverse engineer 11 years of experience in a month. I wasn't insulted. If anything, I felt a strange calm. They didn't understand the structure they were trying to replace, and that ignorance would protect me as much as my legal groundwork. Then the internal communications team published a glowing feature about Sunland's new optimized routing platform. The diagrams in the article were mine, ZMAP's visual outputs scrubbed clean and relabeled. Savannah was quoted as the visionary behind it. No mention of me, not even in the fine print. That was the moment the last traces of hesitation burned away. They weren't just taking credit, they were rewriting history to erase me entirely. If I didn't finish building my own exit one day, they'd announce the system as theirs and hand me a polite thank you card on the way out. So I finalized my private build. I locked down my signature control. I prepared contracts. I gathered proof. For the first time since joining Sunland, I no longer saw myself as an employee. I saw myself as the owner of the engine they depended on and someone ready to walk away if they pushed 1 inch further. The signs came from HR first, always the early tremors before a quake. I received an email titled Performance Alignment Review, inviting me to a meeting with HR Colton and Savannah. I hadn't had a formal performance review in years. My value was always measured in crises prevented, not slide decks produced. But the tone of the email was sterilized, corporate, and cold. Alignment with new strategic direction, streamlining roles. I knew what those words meant. The meeting confirmed it. Savannah criticized me for being overly focused on technical detail, as if the job didn't depend on technical detail. Colton asked, "If you weren't here tomorrow, could someone else step into your role seamlessly? Have you documented everything thoroughly?" I answered honestly. I'd written guidelines, but much of the job required experience. They nodded, pretending to take notes, but what they really wanted was confirmation that I wasn't irreplaceable. They were testing how close they were to letting me go. After the meeting, I decided to conduct a small experiment. For years, whenever weather issues hit the Midwest, I stepped in, automatically adjusting routes, protecting duty limits, preserving connections. This time, I let the core system handle a few minor disruptions on its own, no overrides, no hidden recalculations. The result was predictable delays stretched longer than usual. Passengers sat on taxiways waiting for new slots, and coordination between crew rotations faltered. The whispers started almost immediately. "Operations seems off lately." I felt guilty, of course. Letting the system fail wasn't in my nature. But I also felt clarity, sharp, undeniable clarity. Everything I feared was true. The company relied on me far more than anyone admitted. When the post-incident review meeting happened, Savannah hinted that some routing decisions lacked proactive adjustment. That was the moment I stopped letting myself be the quiet target. I pulled up the logs, showed timestamps, weather shifts, the restrictions they'd placed on fallback routes because of cost concerns. The room fell silent. They couldn't pin the failure on me, not without exposing their own decisions. Still, the larger plan to phase me out continued. I stumbled upon an internal memo outlining a proposal to partner with an outside SaaS vendor for network optimization. The idea was to reduce dependency on internal tools and personnel, a euphemism for replacing ZMAP and me with something generic. I almost laughed. They wanted to trade a system built from a decade of lived operational knowledge for an out-of-the-box optimizer that had never met the realities of mountain turbulence or rolling crew shortages. But the laughter didn't hide the chill running through me. They weren't interested in evolution. They were interested in erasure. One afternoon, as I packed up to leave, a senior executive, older, weathered someone who remembered the Herald era, pulled me aside. "I know what you do here," he said quietly. "Not everyone agrees with how Colton is handling things. If Herald decides to intervene again, would you consider taking on more responsibility?" I didn't answer. Responsibility wasn't the problem. Respect was, recognition was, safety was. I told him right now I just want not to be treated like a disposable patch. A few days later, the decisive blow arrived. An email appeared in my inbox titled Strategic Ops Restructuring Meeting. The invite list was small: Colton, Savannah, HR, IT leadership, and me. The description used vague jargon, streamlining realignment, process clarity. But the meaning was obvious. They were preparing to officially remove me from the system I built. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that I had already moved everything I needed out of their reach. I had the full ZMAP. I had the legal groundwork. I had Herald's backing. I had the digital signature system locking their operations behind me. For years they had assumed I would never fight back. Now the arena was set, and they were the ones walking in unprepared. That morning before the meeting that would end my employment, I arrived earlier than usual and sat alone in the ops room. The monitors glowed softly in the low light, the familiar hum of servers filling the silence. I checked every module of ZMAP still running on the company's infrastructure, making sure the parts they legally owned remained intact and functional. Everything that belonged to me, the weather layers, the dynamic fallback logic, the NOTAM filters was insulated, cleanly separated, no longer embedded in their system the way it had been before. I disabled several advanced scripts that had always run quietly beneath the surface scripts that had saved them more times than they knew. I didn't delete anything, didn't corrupt anything. I simply returned the system to what they had actually paid for. Nothing more, nothing less. Then I checked the signature framework I'd built with IT months earlier. It was exactly as designed. Every flight plan requiring final approval would look for my digital certificate. Without it, the system would stall. No shortcuts, no overrides. When I finally walked toward the 14th floor conference room, my hands were steady. I wasn't walking into an ambush anymore. I was walking into confirmation of what I already knew. And this time I wasn't empty-handed. I had my logs, my documentation, my lawyer, and Harold's quiet backing. No matter how they tried to play this, I wouldn't be leaving with nothing. The meeting went exactly as expected, cold, polished, rehearsed. Colton delivered his speech about a new era and a vision aligned with future strategy. HR read their memorandum about termination effective immediately. Savannah avoided my eyes. I asked my question, the one about routing every single flight in his father's network for 11 years, and Colton brushed it aside with the same phrase he'd practiced, effective immediately. So I removed my badge, set it on the table, and spoke the truth they didn't understand until too late. You have about 20 minutes before the first planes get held on the ground. Tell your father I said good luck. It wasn't a threat. It was a technical forecast. When I left the building, the afternoon sun hit me like a release. I walked to a cafe near the airport, ordered nothing, and sat by the window with my laptop open. From there, I could see the runway stretch toward the horizon. I opened my private monitoring dashboard. I didn't touch anything. I wasn't their employee. I simply watched. 10 minutes passed, then 15. And right on schedule, the first rejection notices appeared. Flight plans missing a valid signature. Others stuck in pending because the system couldn't authenticate final approval. Emails began firing inside the ops center, confused, urgent, frantic. Someone tried to bypass the signature requirement. Someone else tried to assign admin privileges to Savannah. But the system didn't care about titles. It cared about certificates. And the only one attached to the operational chain belonged to me. My phone buzzed with a message from an old colleague. She's trying to sign off on flights, but your signature framework won't let anyone through. Of course it wouldn't. That was the point of compliance. Then the call came from Harold. He asked where I was, whether I was all right, and told me he'd just heard about the termination from his son. He'd also just received the system-wide alerts that several flight plans were stuck. Don't take action yet, he said. Don't break anything, but don't fix anything either. Let me talk to the board. And James, don't let the passengers become casualties of this. I sat there looking out at the runway, knowing exactly what he meant. I had one foot outside the company, but responsibility didn't vanish just because my badge did. Those 20 minutes were only the beginning. The real reckoning was still ahead. After Harold's first call, the cafe felt impossibly quiet. I watched the pending flight plans stack up on my dashboard like cars lining on a highway with no green lights ahead. I didn't interfere. I didn't sign. I didn't sabotage. I simply waited, no longer an employee, but undeniably still the person the system expected. Then my phone rang again, this time from Sunland's main line. A manager in ops sounded breathless. James, FAA is holding multiple plans. We can't dispatch. We need your signature. Where is it? I answered plainly. You ended my employment 15 minutes ago. You can't ask me to continue performing tasks as if I'm still staff, especially ones that carry legal responsibility. Silence. Then a quiet admission. Harold wants to speak with you. Please hold. When Harold came on the line, his voice had shifted from frustration to command. He told me he had already instructed ops to keep the affected aircraft on the ground until everything was resolved. No flight leaves unless the final technical authority approves it, he said. And that authority is you. He asked me to return to the building not to work, but to meet with him, Colton, and members of the board for an emergency discussion. Do not sign anything, he repeated. Not yet. Back at headquarters, I was led into a small windowless room beside the ops center. Inside sat Harold, a board member, HR, and Colton, who looked both angry and unsettled. Savannah was noticeably absent. Harold began by asking me to walk them through everything: how ZMAP originated, which parts I created independently, which systems required my signature, and why, and which modules existed only because I had funded them personally. When I finished, Harold turned to his son. You terminated the company's operational anchor without a transition plan, he said. That isn't leadership. It's recklessness. Then he added more sharply, you've been calling unpaid, undocumented reliance on a single employee teamwork. It isn't. I opened my laptop and displayed the logs, the near miss in Denver, the fallback logic they never knew about, the API invoices billed to my card, the archived warnings I'd sent that were overridden for marketing reasons. The board member's expression tightened as he flipped through Harold's printed emails. These incident gaps were never reported, he said quietly. For the first time since joining Sunland, I spoke not as an employee, but as someone negotiating terms. I'll clear the backlog, I said. I'll sign every pending plan to ensure no passenger is harmed by what happened today. But from this moment forward, if I continue working with Sunland, it will be as an independent consultant, not an employee reporting under your org chart. My conditions were simple: a temporary consulting agreement for the current crisis, a long-term contract with explicit IP boundaries, direct reporting lines that did not involve Savannah. Colton snapped, accusing me of holding the airline hostage, but Harold cut him off with a single raised hand. This is not coercion, he said. This is the cost of failing to respect the person who has kept this company in the air for 11 years. The board member proposed formalizing the arrangement immediately, a 72-hour consulting authorization, so I could restore operations, followed by a full review of the longer-term contract. I accepted on the condition that everything was documented and signed on the spot by Harold and the board representative. And just like that, I walked back into the ops center, but not as the man they'd fired. I was the consultant brought in to rescue the network they couldn't run without me. As I began reviewing and signing the delayed flight plans, one thing became clear. I wasn't just part of the story anymore. I had become a deciding piece in the power struggle that would determine Sunland's future and my own. For the next 72 hours, Sunland operated in a strange, in-between state, half crisis, half awakening. I worked just as I always had, routing around storms, adjusting crew timing, approving plans. But every decision I made was logged under my consulting ID, not an employee badge. Every action had a timestamp and a price tag attached. For the first time, my work wasn't invisible. People in ops looked at me differently, not with awe or fear, but with a sharpened understanding the system had never run itself. There had always been a human spine inside the machine, and that spine had a name. When the 72 hours ended, we met in a conference room, Harold, Colton, legal representatives, my attorney, and me. The air was thick, but it wasn't the same tension as before. This time, I wasn't the one at risk. I introduced Knox Routing and Ops, the company I had formally registered 2 days earlier. I laid out the proposal. Sunland would license ZMAP under clear contractual terms, not ownership assumptions. I would provide routing oversight as an external specialist. I would retain IP rights, and I would reserve the option to consult for other airlines. Colton immediately objected, insisting the airline had invested in me. My lawyer countered with documentation, origin logs of ZMAP timestamps predating my full-time employment, invoices for data sources charged to my personal accounts, the development I'd done off hours on my own hardware. The facts were concrete, inconvenient, and undeniable. Harold looked at his son and said, "If we fight him on ownership, we'll end up in court, and the only people hurt will be the passengers stranded on the tarmac. If we work with him, we keep the network operational. The choice is obvious." Colton didn't like the choice, but he didn't have the leverage to argue. Then came the compromise proposal: return as an internal director report to Colton, keep the optics clean. I declined immediately. No more internal chains, I said. No reporting under Savannah. No undefined responsibilities. I work as a vendor under contract with boundaries we both agree to. If they wanted my expertise, they would meet me at ground level, not above me, not below me. The board member who had spoken with me weeks earlier supported the stance. He emphasized that relying on an external operational specialist wasn't a weakness, but a modernization step one that protected the company from internal blind spots. A vote was taken. The board sided with Harold. A contract was drafted, printed, and placed in front of me. Harold signed first, then the board representative, then me, James Knox, not employee, not subordinate, but principal of Knox Routing and Ops. The moment the pen left the paper, everything felt different. Not triumphant, just balanced. Fair. Correct. The contract detailed that operational routing decisions would connect directly between me and ops leadership. Savannah's role was restricted to marketing and network branding, where she excelled and where the airline needed her away from the levers she never understood. After the meeting, Colton stopped me in the hallway. His expression was stiff, guarded, but not hostile. "You put us in a difficult spot," he said quietly. "But no one can deny the airline runs because of what you built." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he'd ever come to honesty. I answered, "That's why this contract matters, so no one can pretend otherwise again." Then I walked out of the building not as someone fired, but as someone whose value had finally been named, priced, and signed. And for the first time I carried something better than a badge. A contract that recognized the truth of what I'd done for 11 years, and what I was capable of beyond them. 1 year later, I sat in my small Denver office overlooking a secondary runway. My office, my space, my choice. Knox Routing and Ops had grown into something real enough to stand on its own. The room was quiet, filled with the hum of new equipment, clean desks, and the feeling that everything inside belonged to me. Outside the window, aircraft from half a dozen airlines lifted into the cold air. Some bore the Sunland logo. Some belonged to small regional carriers that had found me through industry whispers. All of them flew with routes shaped by something that started in a cramped ops room over a decade earlier, something I once let be taken for granted. Now ZMAP wasn't a hidden tool inside a corporate machine. It was a licensed product, a branded service, a platform with documentation, updates, and a team. I'd hired a data engineer and a young coordinator, bright, curious, eager to learn. I taught them, but not the way I had taught before, not as a tired employee patching holes in silence. Now every lesson had structure, context, purpose. Their growth strengthened the company instead of draining me dry. Harold visited occasionally, dropping by with a newspaper or a warm drink. He never asked for reports, only stories. He remained my silent investor, but more importantly, he'd become someone who simply understood what it meant to build something and be nearly erased from it. He never let me forget that getting pushed out had also pushed me towards something better. Colton kept his distance. Our interactions were limited, strictly professional. He no longer pretended I was replaceable, and I no longer pretended he understood ops. That equilibrium worked for both of us. Savannah shifted fully into marketing, where she performed well without overreaching into operations. Once, after a turbulent week of heavy holiday traffic, she sent a short email thanking me for preventing a campaign from colliding with operational limits. It wasn't emotional, but it was genuine. Within Sunland, the memory of the day the flight plan stalled lingered. They documented more. They planned better. They stopped assuming that invisible labor was infinite. And they never again allowed a critical function to rest unacknowledged on one person's shoulders. The company grew not because of me, but because it finally understood how systems and people must share the load. As for me, I rebuilt my relationship with responsibility. I still cared about safety. I still cared about passengers. But I no longer tied my worth to self-sacrifice. Boundaries didn't make me less committed. They made my commitment sustainable. One afternoon in winter, Harold visited again. He stood beside me at the window looking at the runway, then at the new ZMAP interface glowing on my screens. "If you had walked back into Sunland as an employee that day," he said, "you'd still be in that windowless room in Phoenix." I nodded. "You didn't pull me out," I said. "You just turned on the light so I could see the door." Walking through it was on me. He smiled, understanding exactly what I meant. I realized then that the past year had taught me something simple and profound. Responsibility mattered. Integrity mattered. But letting myself be consumed wasn't noble, it was destructive. A boundary wasn't a wall that kept people out. It was a gate that let the right people in and kept the wrong ones from taking everything. Knox Routing and Ops had plans now: automation for fallback logic, collaborative ops, modeling a training pipeline to ensure no single person would ever hold a company hostage or be held hostage by it. I refused to build a world that repeated what I had escaped. As dawn flights taxied out, one Sunland aircraft accelerated and lifted into the air, followed seconds later by a jet from a carrier I'd just signed. Two very different airlines, both following paths I'd helped shape. I watched them climb and thought I'm still mapping routes between storms, still guiding people where they need to go. The difference now is simple: my own route is clear too. I wasn't an invisible worker behind someone else's logo anymore. I was the owner of my work, the author of my boundaries, and the navigator of my future. For 11 years I drew the sky for someone else's company. Now finally the sky I draw is my own. I was the owner of my work, the author of my boundaries, and the navigator of my future. For 11 years I drew the sky for someone else's company. Now finally the sky I draw is my own. I thought that would feel like an ending. It didn't. It felt like that quiet minute in the cockpit after pushback before the engines spool up, when everything is poised and nothing is guaranteed. On the surface, my life was calmer. No more 2 a.m. calls from a boss who thought emergency meant his slide deck might look bad. No more being treated like a safety net people could land on face first without ever learning how to stand. My days were full but clean calls with dispatchers, model runs, contract reviews, training sessions with my small team. Yet under that calm, there was a constant low hum of tension, the awareness that with every new client, every new decision, I was now fully responsible for what Knox Routing and Ops chose to be. I couldn't blame a CEO or a culture anymore. If this company ever turned into the kind of machine that chewed through people for performance metrics, the person who built it that way would be me. The first crack in the smooth new routine came on an ordinary Thursday. I was reviewing a regional carrier's expansion plan when an email from Sunland flashed across my screen, flagged high priority. The subject line was simple: request for system review, regulatory audit. The message beneath was not. A federal oversight body was opening an inquiry into several operational practices across the industry: rapid turnarounds, fatigue edges, aggressive routing in constrained airspace. Sunland had been selected for a deeper look, partly because of its strong on-time record. Someone somewhere had asked the same question I had wrestled with for years: are they that good, or are they cutting too close? They wanted a full audit of routing decisions, overrides, and near incidents over the past 5 years. They wanted logs, they wanted analyses, and they wanted testimony from key technical figures responsible for network routing during the relevant period. That meant me. A few hours later, my phone rang. It was the same board member who had backed my vendor arrangement. His tone was careful. "James, we'd like you to help us present the best possible version of our operations to the regulators," he said. No lies, but context, emphasis. I knew what he meant. Don't erase the truth, but make sure it doesn't burn the building down. The problem was, the truth was already sitting in a folder on my server: years of logs showing where I had pulled them back from the edge, and years of emails showing where they had wanted to go over it. That night, I pulled up my old file, the one I had started in the dark ops room when I finally got tired of letting reality be rewritten. Log. Things I did that no one knows. Now, a lot more people knew, at least internally, but regulators were different. They didn't care who got credit. They cared who took risks. As I scrolled through the entries, the same story repeated in different weather in different cities: marketing-driven demands, optimistic scheduling, my quiet interventions. If I laid all this out in a straightforward way, regulators would see that Sunland's safety record wasn't an accident. It was the result of someone like me refusing to let numbers override physics. That was good news for passengers. It was bad news for anyone who had built a brand on the myth of strategic genius. The next week, Sunland flew me back to Phoenix for a prep session. I walked into a different conference room this time, smaller, more serious. Harold was there, of course. So was Colton, looking older and more worn around the eyes, and two attorneys in gray suits who introduced themselves with firm handshakes and forgettable names. Savannah joined by video from some hotel lounge, her background blurred. Her face lit up when she saw me, then settled into something neutral, as if she wasn't sure which version of me she was supposed to react to. One of the attorneys pulled up a presentation of their own. They had combed through the logs and pulled out a sanitized patterned Sunland, as cautious, proactive, collaborating closely with a brilliant internal engineer. It was a nicer story, but not an accurate one. The edges were gone, the pressure, the ignored warnings, the campaigns that nearly overran the system. "We're asking you to align with this framing," the attorney said. "Everything here is technically true. We just don't want to drag personalities or internal disagreements into a federal hearing." Harold's eyes moved from the screen to me. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the question hanging between us. "How much of the past are you willing to bend?" Colton shifted in his chair. "We're not asking you to lie," he said. "Just don't make it sound like we almost killed people." I thought of the sunrise route over the mountains, the reroutes around Denver storms, the wildfires that turned my screen red and forced last-minute pivots. We hadn't killed anyone. Not because they never pushed too far, but because when they did, someone refused to let it stand. My conflict wasn't about revenge. I had no interest in watching Sunland implode, taking thousands of jobs and routes with it. But I also knew what happened when small lies piled up around hard truths. People taught themselves that as long as their intentions were good, the damage didn't count. "I can't pretend the system always worked the way this deck implies," I said. "If they ask me directly whether there were internal pressures to prioritize efficiency over margin, I'm not going to say no." One of the lawyers frowned. "If you present it too harshly, you expose yourself as well," he said. "These were your systems, your signatures." That was true. I had saved them from themselves, but I had also carried the weight of every approval. My name sat on every green light. "Then I'll own my part," I said. "I'll say I designed safeguards because I didn't trust the incentives around me. That I pushed back when I could, and when I couldn't, I built traps for bad decisions." Harold finally spoke. "Let him tell the truth," he said quietly. "If this company can't survive honest scrutiny, it doesn't deserve to." He didn't look at his son when he said it, but he didn't need to. Colton exhaled slowly, like he could feel his image being peeled back layer by layer. The day of the hearing, the room was colder than the Denver office, and brighter than the ops center had ever been. Regulators asked precise, patient questions. I answered just as precisely. Yes, there had been pressure to push routes closer to weather or performance limits. Yes, I had written emails warning about certain campaign timings. Yes, at times my safeguards had been the only buffer between marketing ambition and operational reality. No, I had never been ordered to knowingly break a rule. The line had always been drawn 1 inch inside legality, and I had spent years trying to keep it from creeping further. When they asked about my departure, I didn't describe personal drama. I phrased it simply. There was a disconnect between how critical my function was and how it was treated internally. I set boundaries. They set theirs. The company decided it no longer wanted that dependency inside its payroll. We realigned our relationship through a vendor contract instead. It was the truth without theatrics. But in the silence that followed, I could feel everyone in the room filling in the gaps. Afterward, in the hallway, one of the younger regulators stopped me. "I've read your logs," she said. "Whatever the politics were, you did the right thing more often than not." Her tone wasn't congratulatory, it was matter of fact. Just, don't build another system where it all rests on you. That sentence landed harder than anything in the formal session. Back in Denver, that warning echoed in my head as I watched Jess and our data guy work through a complex reroute for a new client. They were good better every month. But I noticed how often they still glanced at me for confirmation, how their shoulders relaxed, only after I nodded. It was flattering and terrifying. I had left a company that depended too much on me only to risk creating a new one that could do the same in a softer, friendlier way. One evening long after they had gone home, I sat alone with the monitors dimmed and the city lights flickering outside. I thought about the values I claimed to stand on now: responsibility without martyrdom, boundaries without abandonment, leadership without exploitation. If I truly believed in those things, Knox Rooting and Ops had to be more than a vehicle for my talent. It had to be a place where no one, not even me, was treated as the only thing standing between order and chaos. So I did something that felt both risky and necessary. I started moving my own name out of the center of the system. We built shared approvals, redundant knowledge paths, documented decision trees that anyone on the team could follow. I forced myself to let Jess run scenarios without my input, then live with her choices as long as they met the standards we'd set together. When she flagged something she wasn't sure about, I didn't grab the controls out of her hands. I walked her through the options until she could verbalize the logic herself. Around the same time, a major legacy carrier reached out with an offer that would have thrilled me a year before: an exclusive high-paying contract that would take up most of Knox Routing's capacity. The catch was simple, and deadly exclusivity would mean no work for smaller regional airlines, and a clause deep in the agreement would give them rights to co-develop and internalize routing logic over time. In a few years, they would own a version of the system and no longer need us. It was a more polite, more lucrative version of the story I'd already lived. My attorney walked me through the implications. Financially, saying yes would secure us for years. Morally, it would gut the mission I told myself this company had to offer: grounded, independent operational judgment in an industry that routinely forgot how fragile it really was. If I signed, I'd be trading away the very autonomy I'd fought so hard to earn, just at a higher price. I stared at the contract for a long time. One part of me, the tired, still scarred part, whispered that this was security, that I'd be stupid to turn it down. Another part, the one that had finally walked out of Phoenix with my head up, knew that I would be walking right back into a gilded version of the same trap. In the end, I called the airline's representative and declined. Politely. Firmly. I told them we could work together, but not on exclusive terms and not under a structure that quietly transferred our core into their walls. They were surprised. Not many vendors turned down offers like that. But I slept better that night than I had all week. Months later, looking out at the runway again, I realized something had shifted. I was still drawing routes through storms and tight skies. I was still responsible for lives I would never meet. But I was no longer doing it to prove my worth to people who only valued what they could extract. I was doing it on my own terms, with a team that knew both my strengths and my limits. I once believed power meant being the person no one else could replace. Now I understood it meant the opposite: building something so honest and well-structured that no one had to carry the whole weight alone. The sky outside hadn't changed. The planes still rose into the same thin air. But the way I moved through that world had. I was still the owner of my work, still the author of my boundaries, still the navigator of my future. And this time I wasn't flying solo just because no one else could. I was choosing my route with my eyes open, with both hands on the map, and with the quiet certainty that if turbulence came again, I knew exactly where my line was.